If you're wondering when the war between the United States and China is going to start, then it has already started. War isn't about sending your military and aircraft carriers to the other side of the world. You can only do that when one country is significantly superior than the other country, such as the war in Iraq, because otherwise there is going to be a serious response from the other side, and that will lead to the devastating consequences for the both countries. In fact, there was such a situation between China and the United States back in 1996. You see, China back in 1996 was one of the poorest countries in the world. It just opened up to the world and its economy wasn't really as advanced as it's today. So, when there was an election in Taiwan, when the first democratically elected president was elected in Taiwan, guess what China did? It started military exercises right beside Taiwan. And Bill Clinton, who was the president of the United States back then, sent the largest aircraft carrier to the Taiwanese Strait in order to send a signal or a message to the Chinese Communist Party that if you actually get out of line, there is going to be consequences. China instantly backed down. But that situation is no longer the case. China became the second world's largest economy, and the Chinese military is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, which is why the United States is not going to have such a war. In fact, it is going to be an economic war, a financial war. So whoever actually stays the longest in this war is going to win this war. Something like that has happened with the Soviet Union. Remember, the two countries actually had a Cold War, because if it would have turned into a real war, there would not be a winner. So, after decades of actually having a financial war between the two countries, the Soviet Union couldn't actually keep fighting, and the entire economy of the Soviet Union collapsed, and it actually led to the collapse of the entire Union, that it actually fell down into 15 different countries. So when Trump became president in 2016, he immediately started preparing the United States for a war. But guess what? The United States is not in a capacity in order to continue this war and even win this war. The United States actually tried to do with China exactly what it did with Japan. Because if you actually go back to 1990s and 1980s, there were a lot of rumors that Japan is going to overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world. The United States instantly helped Japan after World War II, and Japanese companies instantly took off and dominated the entire US market. If you go back to 1970s and 80s and 90s, you will find out that Japanese electronics and especially Japanese cars flooded the American market and literally dominated it. Like, American car companies had no chance to compete with Japanese cars, because Japanese cars were, first of all, cheaper, and secondly, they were simply better quality. What would you choose? A cheaper, better car from a Japanese brand, or an American car that is going to cost you much more and it's not going to be of that high quality like the Japanese car? But the problem was that the United States wouldn't actually just stand aside and watch how everybody is taking over the United States. But the problem was that the United States is the champion of democracy. The United States is the champion of capitalism. The US can't simply manipulate its currency. The problem was that the dollar was already a very strong currency compared, for example, to the Japanese currency. So American car companies couldn't actually compete in Japan, because if you go to Japan with your expensive American giant car, you couldn't actually sell it. Yes, there were actually some sales, but it was nothing compared to the Japanese cars in the United States. So America had to do something. Back then, the US president was Ronald Reagan, and the plan was simply to devalue the dollar. But if the United States did it without actually the consent of its partners, then it would actually be called currency manipulation, and the United States would be accused of not actually following the rules of the free trade. And that's not what the United States wants, especially when it was fighting the Soviet Union and was trying to present itself as the savior of democracy and freedom. I mean, just imagine the leader of the free world being accused of not following the actual rules of being the leader of the free world itself. And that's why Ronald Reagan got into place all of the major trading partners of the United States, Japan, the UK, Germany, and France, if I'm not mistaken, and they signed a deal in order to devalue the dollar. And that's when the Japanese economy collapsed. Because if the trend would have continued the way it is, it was a matter of time before Japan would actually overtake the United States. But when they actually devalued the dollar, guess what happened? Japanese exports or Japanese imports to the United States became much more expensive, and they couldn't compete with American car companies. And that's when the bubble in Japan burst and crushed the entire Japanese economy. And guess what? That problem still exists. The Japanese economy haven't actually recovered until today. And the United States wanted the exact same thing to happen with the Chinese economy. But Chinese people have realized that, and they didn't actually fall for that trap and didn't agree to devalue the dollar. That's why Trump, for example, when he became the president, he instantly started blaming China for manipulating its currencies in order to make its exports much cheaper compared to the US products. I mean, you have seen that all over the news, and it was one of the main reasons why Trump actually started a trade war with China. Because China understands that if our currency becomes too stronger, yes, our people will become wealthier than they are right now, but they will not be able to compete with the US products. The goal of China is to keep their products price competitive, especially back in the days they were producing less quality products. And the United States didn't actually care, because the United States is a developed country, one of the highest earners. And China was a developing country that was trying to get itself together in order to turn itself into a developed country in the first place. But the problem or the difference between Japan back then and China today is fundamentally different. They're not competing the exact same way. Because if you go back, for example, to 1990s, the average Japanese was much wealthier than the average American. The GDP per capita in Japan was $44,000, while in the United States, $28,000. But that is not the case between China and the United States today. The GDP per capita in China is less than $13,000, while in the US is like $81,000. Do you see the difference? There is still a lot of room to grow for China in order to actually reach the levels from the United States. While in Japan back in those days, there was not a lot of room to grow. It was already a bubble and the bubble burst. And that's not the case with China today. So the situation with China today is very different from the situation that the United States had actually with Japan. And that is the first problem, because if China wants to overtake the United States, all it had to do is to simply double this number, where the GDP per capita will be around $25,000 and would bring the average Chinese to the average like Portuguese or to the average Polish. And these are the countries that stand no chance against the United States. But even with those numbers, the GDP in China is going to be like almost $40 trillion, overtaking the United States. And that is the threat that the US perfectly understands. Another problem is that China is a huge market for US companies. We always hear about the news that Chinese companies are taking advantage of the United States and selling their products in the US market. So if we actually prevent Chinese companies from selling in the US market, they will start listening to us. So we will impose tariffs on them. But the problem is that it also works the other way around. Yes, if you would go like 20 years ago, Chinese on average were much poorer, so they wouldn't be able to afford high technology. But today there is a large portion of China, which is probably like a few 100 million people, which is as much as the entire population of the United States, can afford the same standard of living like most Americans. So if you kind of take a look at the long list of US companies that sell in China, you will find that a big chunk of their revenue comes from China. Let me give you a few examples. Apple, for instance, relies on China for 20% of its sales. And that might not seem a lot, but it's really a lot. Like it's in billions, tens of billions of dollars. So if China, for example, tomorrow imposes tariffs, like a 50% tariffs on iPhones, suddenly sales of Apple in China is going to plummet. An American company, which is Apple, is going to suffer. But it's not just about Apple. Intel, 27% comes from China. Tesla, 26%. Nvidia, 26%. Qualcomm, 67%. And these are just a few examples. You have Nike, you have Coca-Cola, you have Johnson & Johnson. The list of companies that find the Chinese market a huge market for them is huge. Even Boeing. I mean, Boeing sells planes. It's the leader in the industry. Yes, it has been suffering recently because of the latest model. But nonetheless, if it wants to sell in China, then the United States needs good trading relationships. Otherwise, they are going to simply impose 100% tariffs on Boeing, and Boeing will stand no chance to compete in the Chinese market. But that's something that Trump wants. It might actually hurt American companies, but Trump literally wants to hurt American companies. I'm not here trying to say anything negative about Trump or criticize him for anything like that, but that's the plan that Trump has in the first place. Trump's plan is to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And in order to do that, he wants to hurt American companies as much as possible in order for them to feel the pain and understand that it's much more beneficial for them to bring and come back to the United States and shift their manufacturing back to the United States. Maybe the CEOs of all of those tech companies disagree with Trump. They have been actually making billions of dollars, trillions of dollars over the last couple of decades. But Trump is like, it's over, come back to the United States, build your thing in the United States. I'm not even sure about if the economics is going to work out, but that's basically the plan. Because corporations hate the trade war more than anything else. The same thing we can say about the corporations in China, and the same thing goes to the corporations in the United States. Because for them to lose the market in China is a tremendous loss. Now, another problem is that China is creating a backdoor to the United States and the US companies as well, in order to avoid the tariffs that the Trump administration or any administration is going to impose on China. You see, 10 or 15 years ago, China realized that there is a risk to rely on the US market, and something like that is going to happen, and a trade war is a real possibility with the United States. So instead of directly selling everything from China to the United States, especially when we talk about cars and electronics, they started investing heavily in the neighboring country, which is called Mexico. And Mexico enjoys the best not the best relationships, but they have a free trade agreement with the United States, which means that if a Chinese company is going to come to Mexico, build their factories and manufacture that in Mexico, and then ship it to the United States, there is no tariff. So if Trump, for example, tomorrow imposes more tariffs on China, then China has a backdoor. Just take a look at the exports from Mexico. They mostly go to the United States. Like almost 80% of all the exports from Mexico goes directly to the United States. And that's not the case, for example, with imports. Chinese companies building factories in Mexico in order to avoid Trump's tariffs. And the reason that this number is so insanely high, it's not only being taken advantage by China. As I have told you earlier, that American companies are building a lot of their cars, a lot of their manufacturing in Mexico, since the cost of labor in Mexico is cheaper and it's much more profitable in order to set up your companies over in Mexico. And with the free trade agreement, you can ship those products to the United States. So this is the backdoor that they have been actually building for years, if not, for the last probably like 10 to 15 years. Another problem is that China has reduced its dependence on the United States. If you go back, for example, 20 years ago, probably around 20 to 25% of all the revenue of China or all the exports from China would go to the United States. But that number has been dropped significantly to less than 15%. So China, yes, United States for China is a huge trading partner, but only 15% of their trade or exports goes to the United States. And that number has been reduced. Take a look at 2017. It was more than 18%. Now it's less than 15%. And probably over the next 5 to 10 years, as other countries keep developing and China keeps diversifying its exports, United States might simply play a 10% role or maybe an 8% role. And that's when the United States will have almost no influence on China. But that's not even the entire problem. The United States needs China for its technology. You've been hearing the opposite all the time, where they would tell you that China needs US technology. And that's absolutely true. There is not a single country on the face of the earth that would come close to the United States. In a lot of major technologies, especially when we talk about semiconductors, United States dominates the world. In space technology, the United States dominates the world. But the gap has shrunk so much that there are certain industries and a pretty long list of industries where the United States lost its edge. And China has overtaken the US in those industries, and without China, the United States cannot actually operate, at least in the foreseeable future. And one of those industries is battery manufacturing. Today, as we are moving away from oil, every new technology needs a battery. And who is the largest producers of batteries and the most advanced batteries in the world? Exactly, China. As of now, China dominates around 77% of the entire battery manufacturing, and the United States simply has around 6% of the market. Do you see the difference? There is no competition between China and the United States. The United States simply controls it all. It will take the United States another probably like 15 to 20 years at least to be a real competitor to China. And according to a lot of experts, even by 2027, that share of China's control is going to be around 70%. That's just a projection. Maybe China will literally take over the entire industry. Think about that. EVs. How do EVs operate? Exactly. On batteries. If you take any electrical car and you look at the components, the most expensive part and the most high-tech part of that entire EV is a battery, or the batteries that it has. Tesla cannot build its cars without batteries. And everybody knows that electrical cars, electrical trucks, electrical vehicles overall are going to be the future, and as the world is moving away from oil, which is why the United States needs Chinese batteries in order to keep Teslas running in the United States. And there is literally no competition between Chinese EVs and US EVs. BYD has overtaken Tesla and is now the largest manufacturer of EVs. And that trend, or the gap between the two countries, is going to keep growing over and over. In fact, think about that for a moment. If the United States is going to take off the tariffs from the Chinese EVs, I think China is going to dominate the entire US market within a single year. But the United States does not want to repeat the mistake that it had done with Japan back in 1970s and 80s. Like, the United States was so confident during those days. They were like, why are we afraid of Japan? Let them build cars and let them bring it to the United States, and we're gonna win over them because we have the best manufacturing in the United States. We have the best costs in the United States. But guess what happened? Japan obliterated US companies. Not just in Japan, but they came to the US and destroyed US companies and took over the entire industry. Nobody would buy like a Chrysler or Chevrolet when they can buy a Toyota Camry, for example. Which is why United States does not want to repeat the same mistake. Instantly, when EVs became a thing, the US we're gonna have like a 50% tariffs. And now they have increased that tariff from 50% to 100%. And I wouldn't be surprised if they actually increase it to 200%. Because when you wanna buy an EV, for example, in the US, you know, like what, $40,000, $50,000, maybe more than that. You can buy a Chinese EV for like $20,000 or $25,000. So with a 100% tariff, it is going to cost as much as you can get in the United States. But I wouldn't be surprised if within the next couple of years, they're going to drive that price down to $15,000. So even with a 100% tariff, a Chinese EV can come to the United States and still beat US companies at the price. And that is something that the United States is afraid the most. Because what are you going to do at the end of the day? You're going to buy what you can afford. It doesn't really matter whether it comes from China, whether it comes from Japan, it comes from the United States, Canada. It doesn't really matter. If you're making like $60,000, $70,000, you are going to buy the most affordable car possible. So whoever makes the most affordable car at the best quality, that's the car you're going to buy. And it doesn't really matter whether it comes from China or not. So the reason that there are not, for example, affordable electrical cars in the United States yet is simply because I mean, you can't actually get them from China since there is such a high tariff, but the rest of the world enjoys that. I mean, take a look at Europe. Like, Europe doesn't like the fact that Chinese EVs have overtaken the entire European market. But Europe cannot do anything. They want to move into the renewable energy. They want to move away from oil. But if you want to do something like that, then you have to build electrical cars. And China is the best at building electrical cars and batteries. So if you impose tariffs on China, then you're not going to have that transition because you cannot build at the same competitive price that China is building. Now, another industry that China competes or has overtaken the entire world is in solar energy, because it controls around 84% of the entire market. And that gap is so huge that it will take, again, the United States probably 10 to 20 years in order to at least have half of the market. And that's not even a fact. And a lot of things could actually change within the next 30 years. So this is just two examples that I have actually given to you. If you actually go and search, you will find out much more. For example, take the chips or the smartphones. US designs the best or the most advanced chips in the world, or the iPhones or the smartphones, and China manufactures them. You see, it's not just about the cheap labor. It's not about that you can actually pay pennies on the dollar to the Chinese workers. In order to build and manufacture, for example, an iPhone, you need a long line of supply chains and assembly lines and engineers and professionals and skilled people, and you have to get them all together in one place in order to make sure that you can build the most advanced iPhone, in order for you to build the most advanced computer chips, in order for you to build the most advanced computers. And if you take a look at all the US companies, you will find a long list of those companies producing their high technology in China. Because, I mean, of course, you can go to India, you can go to Vietnam, but those countries do not have enough skilled labor to produce them. And that is another reliance on China by the United States. So just entirely creating a full trade war is going to hurt all of those American companies in the first place. Another cost that comes with the trade war is the reputation cost. You see, your reputation isn't actually unlimited. Every time you impose sanctions, every time you impose tariffs, you're losing part of your reputation, because any kind of tariffs, any kind of sanctions is going to present you or show you in the world as the unreliable partner. And that's something that has been happening with the United States over the last decade or so. If you're imposing tariffs or sanctions on small little countries that have no influence in the world, then nobody really cares about that. But when you're imposing sanctions or tariffs on major countries such as China, Russia, or other countries that have real influence, that have real power, what message do you think you're sending to the rest of the world? You're literally telling them, we are unreliable. Today we think like this, and tomorrow we might change our mind and impose tariffs on you if you actually start winning and competing with us. So that creates an alternative world order among those countries that wants to move away from the dollar. And that's why we have BRICS, and that's why we have like 46 countries that want to join BRICS. That's why we have like hundreds of companies, no, not hundreds, but probably like over 100 countries that wants to trade in Chinese yuan instead of the dollar. And over time, the United States could lose its edge as the leader of the free world, because people would look at that and will say that is just a slogan, but it has nothing to do in reality. Because on one side, the United States is screaming about capitalism and the freedom of trade. On the other side, the United States is imposing tariffs when it's losing competition. It's not that China is much more powerful economically than the United States, but China is one of the most populated countries in the world with around 1.5 billion people, and the United States has around 300 million people. With that kind of a population, they could build the second world's largest economy, and the United States is fighting multiple wars at the same time, which is draining its resources, and it's not in a position that it can actually keep fighting this trade war. Maybe yes, the United States is going to survive another Trump presidency, maybe another 4 or 5 years, but sooner or later the United States will come at terms that with China to the point where they can actually trade freely, because US companies will keep suffering. And if the US companies are suffering, what do you think they're going to do? They will try to support and lobby the person who is going to come to the White House and establish friendly trading relationships with China, and that is probably what will happen within the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.